So I'm thrilled today to welcome Dr. William J. Walsh to the Optimal Health Clinic podcast. He's a pioneer in nutritional neuroscience and the founder of the Walsh Institute in America. Dr. Walsh has dedicated his career to understanding how nutrient imbalances impact the brain, especially in developing children, and his works provided countless families with paths to improved mental health and balance. In this interview, we'll explore his expertise on nutritional therapies for children and young people facing ADHD, autism, and other emotional and behavioural challenges, alongside insights into environmental toxins, early intervention, and genetic factors. So I hope we can all approach this with an open mind, as Dr. Walsh's work is rooted in rigorously tested hypothesis and an evidence base that some may find challenge their frame of reference. So my questions have been crafted to give those who are watching today or listening practical guidance for supporting the mental health and development of children and young people. I know you briefly touched on it, but could you please say a bit more? Could you explain how nutrient imbalances can specifically affect the development brain of the child and young person? So what are some of the common imbalances that you've observed in your research?
Doing this now for quite a while, and I think we know a lot about it. And first and foremost, for behavior and ADHD, the very first thing one should do is see whether plasma, zinc, and serum copper are normal, and if they're abnormal, correct it. And if you do that, most of the time, these children or adults even get strikingly better. So that's the first thing. But then we found out that methylation had a lot to do with some of these things, especially behavior. Upset people who are the people who are prone to bad behavior, very often they have they have a will of iron, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. And
Yeah.
actually, if you talk to their parents, you'll find out they were like that by the time they were 1 year old. But we learned that some wonderful families with caring parents were horrified by the child who, at the age of 1 or 2, might torturing the family pet. I had numerous cases of families where the little child murdered the family pet. I mean, some of these cases are striking, and there's so many of them. Well, behavior disorders can come in mild, moderate, and severe. And I was talking, so, but we saw a lot of the severe ones, but also the mild and moderate cases that are more common. So that's number one. And then we also learned that nutrition is very important. And one of the really striking things is that while there's a lot of studies that are in the literature showing how a diet can be related to problems, and even like things like food dyes for ADHD, the red and yellow food dyes, we now know that is really a problem. However, what we recently learned is that the most important nutrients of all are not the food you eat, but the proteins made by your DNA. We are supported every minute of our life. We're kept alive by 80,000 amino acids that our DNA makes.
Yeah.
And that tends to deteriorate with time. So that's probably the newest thing we've learned. Yes, it's incredibly important to have a proper diet in a proper environment. I think the first thing we would recommend for a behavior disorder or ADHD is perhaps counseling, to go and maybe see a psychologist or someone who works with children, because maybe once in a while that's the problem. But usually it's a inborn genetic imbalance that it tends to be permanent through your life that's easily corrected.
So I know you work with thousands of children over the years with ADHD, autism, and other behavioural disorders. Could you please provide me with some examples of success stories?
Well, I have working with the doctors I work with in a clinic we once had, we had 10,000 or more really great case histories. I remember one young man who was 16 years old. He was adopted at birth by a friend of mine who was a scientist, chemist, and his wife was a professional counselor helping troubled children. And the child they adopted at birth from an Indian tribe, by the time he was 16, he was truant, he was violent, he was oppositional defiant. And they predicted that all the experts had said that he was likely to wind up in prison, or a good case for suicide. And he was 16 years old, a sophomore in high school. He had no friends. Well, we tested him, and he didn't have bad metals. His copper and his zinc were normal,
Right.
but he had extraordinary pyrrole levels in his urine. So that's an imbalance, along with copper and zinc, that you need to do quickly for behavior in ADHD, and really for every patient we see. And he was about 10 or 20 times normal high in that. And that's the imbalance that I especially like, because it causes so much problem and is so quickly corrected. He got better in a week.
Wow.
And he, within his next year, he was going to school, and they discovered he was smart. They had no idea he was smart. He was very smart. And he joined the football team, and was sort of a normal kid, and eventually went to the University of Colorado for so he was a college graduate instead of a lost child. And I wonder how many thousands and thousands of kids out there like that who can be saved if you get them early.
We are such strong advocates for early intervention for children. What age do you recommend beginning biochemical evaluations and beginning nutrient therapy for children who show signs of either developmental or behavioural issues? And how early is too early, if at all?
Well, it depends on the condition. For example, if you have a child who is having terrible behavior by the time they're 2 years old, there's something wrong, and it's almost certainly genetic, and it's something that can be corrected. I would say for them, you want to do it really early.
Yeah.
Another early case is if you're seeing autism tendencies. 81% of all true autistics have regressive autism, where they seem to be very normal and typical until about 18 to 20 months of age. And then they tend to regress. They lose their language. They're no longer able to tolerate certain foods, and they shy away from being hugged. And so in that case, you need to have really early intervention. And virtually let's say 95% of all autistics have extraordinary copper zinc imbalance. So that's one thing that should be done right away. And we know that when a person has copper zinc imbalances, it means that there's a proteins called metallothionein genes. So the proteins that they make are involved in brain development. It helps the brain develop. It helps prune away the excess neurons during that first 3, 4, 5 years. And so that's a therapy that can be given really early. And we've learned that we've now treated more than 6,500 autistic children.
Wow.
And what we've learned, at one time we'd seen more autistics than anybody in the world. And we had by far the biggest chemistry database. And what we learned is that if you could treat a autistic child at the age of 2 or 3, you can make more progress in a month than you can in 6 months with an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Because it's a developmental disorder. It involves the brain not being developed quite typically.
Yeah.
So the case of ADHD is a little different. I think in ADHD, if you've got a child that seems to be a space cadet or they're in kindergarten and things aren't going well, a lot of times there's nothing really wrong. And I think a little bit of counseling, perhaps, and a little special education. However, if it persists, then I think that certainly by first grade, at least by then, you should do testing and see if it happens to be with their chemistry.
So we're becoming very aware of environmental toxins and the role they play in mental health and behavioural disorders for children and young people. What measures can parents and caregivers take to protect their children from these toxins?
If you recall the sibling experiment I mentioned, where we had a violent child and an all-American boy, when I got the data and broke the code and got the data, the first thing I found, the violent children living in the same house, the same diet, the same everything, they had extraordinary levels of lead, cadmium, or mercury, and the other children did not. So if you have one of these chemical imbalances, these kids are really vulnerable, more vulnerable than anyone else, to toxic metals and the environment. So yeah, I think that the toxic metals are a problem, and pollution and all of that is a problem for everyone, but especially for people with chemical imbalances, especially if they have pyrroles, chemistry, or copper zinc imbalances. These are the people that are really covered. And I eventually have tested more than 800 criminals, felons who've done terrible things, including quite a few who are on death row. And believe me, if you look at their chemistry, their toxic levels are sky high, and we know that affects brain problems, especially behavior. So it's extraordinarily important.
And it's lovely to hear that there's something. I think that's it for us, having a solution-focused approach, because it's often sticking plaster, which is used, isn't it, or the medical model. So it's lovely to hear that you can actually use the nutrients, and correcting those imbalances can make such a profound difference for these children and families.
I think medication helps hundreds of people, thousands of people. However, I think it's not fair to ask a medication to correct or help a child who has something else wrong.
Yeah.
That's a problem that adds to the problem and can be corrected. And I think that so what we do when we have a child or an adult who is taking medication, who they may say is helping somewhat, and what we do when we find they have the chemistry, we treat the chemistry. And for two months at least, we insist they stay on their Ritalin or their Adderall or their antidepressant. We do both treatments together. And so we correct the chemistry while they're still on the medication. And then after they're better, and most of them are, then they carefully try weaning away the medication to see whether, I always tell them, find out what the best dose is. Yeah. Because things are different now. You have a new reality. And 80% of the ADHD families tell me they're at their best with 0. And so most of these patients no longer need medication. If they lose something when they stop all the medication, so be it.
What advice would you give to parents and caregivers who have children who've been given a diagnosis or a condition like ADHD, autism, or anxiety? And how can they best support the child's nutrient and biochemical needs?
I think the first thing to do is to find out what's wrong. It's hard to fight an enemy if you don't know who or what it is. And the possible different problems a child might have, or an adult, there are many different ones. I just mentioned this teenager who didn't have perfectly okay metals, but something else was wrong. We now know there are about 7 major nutrients that affect brain function. There's more than 300 important nutrients in the human body in biochemistry, but there's only about 6 or 7 that have a major impact on your brain if they're not balanced. So what we do is we focus on them. I think it's important to find out what is wrong with a person's brain chemistry and biochemistry, and there's a wide variation. So people are often coming to me saying, well, what multiple vitamins should I take, or what diet should I have? And the answer is, human beings are individual. They're different. And the best diet for one person is terrible for someone else. We know that overmethylated people thrive on folate and we know that undermethylated people are harmed by folate.
Yeah.
And so the one thing that you can recommend that is good for everybody are antioxidants, things that protect the body and the brain against toxics, antioxidants. And I think not just people with illnesses and diagnoses, I think everybody, because now we know that aging and cancer and heart disease and kidney disease, we're learning the real cause of that is the change in the 80,000 amino acids that your DNA is making, because your DNA is damaged every day we live. And so as that capability deteriorates, that's why people get old. That's why we get wrinkles and diseases.
Yeah.
So I especially for ADHD behavior and even all forms of mental illness, we found that of all the patients we've seen, after we saw 30,000 of them, I had somebody spend a couple months studying their initial chemistry. First time we saw them, 95% of people with a serious problem, including depression, anxiety, have elevated oxidative stress, oxidative overload, free radicals, which part has, for example, toxic metals could cause that, as can many other things.
Yeah.
But it's individualized. I think it must be individualized to do this right. Otherwise, I mean, there's not a single therapy we can give. If we get a patient with a serious problem, we're not going to recommend anything except maybe a better diet, because we don't know what that child's chemistry is and what direction you have to go. Yeah. It's got to be individualized.
So could you tell me how schools and teachers play a role in identifying and supporting children with biochemical imbalances? Are there specific signs they should look out for or interventions they can implement?
Well, teachers, especially for younger grades, I mean, these are dedicated people usually, and they've seen hundreds and hundreds of children usually after they're doing it a while. They can tell children who have a real problem. They know who the behavior disordered kids are, the oppositional defiant children. They know children who are having real trouble studying, or the hyperactive ones who can't settle down. I think as soon as what they can do is quickly, as soon as they see that in a child, they need to let the family know that. They need to let the family know that and urge them to take action. And whether they want to begin with counseling or, really good evaluations, or if the problems are serious, I think they should test their chemistry early. Yeah. And I think we've worked with some special education departments, and we've had really great success, even in inner city, high poverty areas in Chicago. We found that the parents of these children who are prone to gangs and criminal violence, that they were the most dedicated of all of getting compliance. So they would take their violent children, who some of them were already in gangs with guns. We got a foundation grant, went into the inner city and tested their blood. And believe me, these ghetto mothers, they love their children, and they did not want this to happen. And anyway, the results were really good for that group too.
So I'm really interested to hear some of the common challenges and misconceptions you encounter when discussing nutrient therapies with parents and healthcare providers, and how do you address these?
Well, I have this conversation both with families and parents, and also with their doctors, and it's interesting. But basically, it's getting better. By the way, it's getting better, and I'm now. I gave a talk at the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting, at the big meeting where they have like 30,000 people from all over the world, and they let me talk about this very matter. And since that time, we have a program where we train doctors. We now have more than 1,300 doctors, a lot of psychiatrists and medical doctors. We're now doing this in would you believe, 75 different countries. It's going to take a while, but I think it's coming, and we're finding that a lot of doctors don't like just to try to just throw medication at kids.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to help them, but it's sort of a trial and error procedure for so many of them. They'll try a medication they think is going to help the child, and then if that doesn't work, they'll try something else. I think the important thing is for the doctors is to explain to them explain to them what happens to the brain if you have one of these 7 imbalances and how it affects neurotransmitters directly. And we know exactly how it does. And we also know with new field of epigenetics that we now have the ability with nutrients to change gene expression.
Yeah, I love that.
We know how to change gene expression. For example, for many people who have depression, many of them have low serotonin activity. Well, we have methionine and acetylmethionine, which are nutrients that you can buy in stores without a prescription, and they increase activity of serotonin.
Yeah.
So we now have weapons we never had before. And I think that it's logical and it's actually correct. And so now we do get some skeptical people, and I remember we've lost a lot of patients who came into our clinic. And one of their neighbors said, who might be a doctor, might have said, "Well, that's worthless. Don't listen to that." However, more and more and more of them are doing it. I was on national TV a few times about 30 years ago, and we found families are just eager for a way to find out what's wrong with their child and how to help them. This is one possibility, and in fact, I think it's a leading possibility, and so it's getting more and more popular. So we're getting there.
So I'm really interested to know what current research projects you're most excited about at the Walsh Institute, and how do you see the field of biochemical therapy evolving over the next decade, and what would you like to see?
Well, we've done a number of studies, and I think my greatest ability is in experimental research. But what we're doing right now, we have a funded study from a foundation where we're studying the cause of schizophrenia. And we believe we may have come close to understanding the genetic reasons. But even more exciting to me is a study that we're launching. We've been trying to launch for a year. The pandemic slowed us down. I believe we have found the cause of the autism explosion in the world. We believe we understand now what it is. And so we are launching a blind experimental study, and it'll tell us yes or no. And in fact, if we are correct, we'll be able to have autism incidence shrink to almost zero, if their obstetricians and their doctors understand that they should give them one lab test and then normalize something. And it's not metals and it's not pyrroles. I'm not saying a lot about this because I want to get the data first.
Yeah.
Because if this is successful, we can do this.
Wow, that's absolutely phenomenal.
We're still out there doing this. We're small. We're not a huge organization. We're a small public charity, but we have a very scientific bent, very dedicated people working for us, and a lot of volunteers who help at times.
So outside of autism, have you noticed any trends in the prevalence of mental health issues amongst children and young people in recent years? And if you have, what have you noticed?
Oh, I've learned a lot. As I mentioned, we had more than 5,000 cases, and that's a lot of. I heard a lot of stories of misery. So many families who I kept hearing how they had this beautiful child, and by the time the child was a year and a half, they were starting to walk and starting to talk and charming their grandparents, and then a regression would occur. Something horrible would happen very often after they got sick, or if they went to the pediatrician. One story I heard hundreds of times, they took a sick child to the pediatrician when they were like 20 months old, and while they were getting treated for their pneumonia or whatever, they'd say, "Oh, you're behind in your shots," and it would give them this sick child, immune compromised, give them maybe 5 or 6 vaccinations at the same time. I heard that over and over and over. I don't think that vaccinations are the cause of most autism. I don't believe that, and a lot of people do, but they're more vulnerable than most people. And you certainly don't want to give vaccinations to sick children. But anyway, it changed for me when my third child developed autism. My third child, and it was severe. And she was talking, and she lost the ability to talk. And I had her studied by the experts at Northwestern University, and they said she had severe autism, and that we needed to realize that this is incurable. This was now 40 years ago, 40 years ago. And they said that she'll never have a job, have a family, and that she needs to be in some special group, in some institution perhaps, or some program. Well, I started doing research with the great Carl Pfeiffer, and I saw I decided, here I have the man who is probably the world's leading expert on nutritional medicine, and I brought her to him at the age of 12. And 12 years old, at 8 years old, she was still unable to have a conversation, and her IQ tested at 54. Her chemistry was horrible. She had pyrroles and copper and zinc and other things. And the great man fixed it. He fixed my child. Within a month, she was different. I could talk to her. She seemed smart. So against all the education and her record and her files, I got her mainstreamed into a good high school. And we were thrilled when she got C's and D's the first semester. She actually was at a mainstream school. She made the honor roll.
Oh, wow.
She right now, this morning she got in her car and drove to her job at a library. She's a librarian.
That must be such, I
So I
can
get
see that.
emotional.
No, I can see that,
but that doesn't happen to everyone, and it's rare when you get someone that far along. She was 13. We've seen a lot of that happen, but I think that I got involved in a lot of experimental research with other universities and scientists, and they wanted to have us participate in these studies because we had so many autistics. We had probably more autism families come in than anyone in the world. And so what we did is, starting in about 1990, we started doing some experiments to try to understand what was going on with these kids. And one thing I want to mention is that up until 1995, I always wanted to make sure we had a truly autistic kid. We wanted all the data to be as perfect as possible. So we would study every family that would come in. And we found that only about 5% actually didn't have autism. This was a misdiagnosis, so we didn't use them in the study. That changed in the late 1990s. And by 2000, 3 out of 4 families bringing in autistic with a diagnosis of autism did not have autism. They had what they called autism spectrum disorder.
Okay.
And they have symptoms that are similar, but they don't have classical, what I call Canner autism. So that's what's really changed. So now you know, it was quite rare back with the original severe version of autism. It was really quite rare to have a recovery. But now you're hearing a lot of recoveries, but they're not really autistic. But I'm happy for them, but they're not really autistic. Oh, that's been a major change. So now we're talking about maybe 3 or 4 or 5% of children who are autistic. No, it's still higher than it was. It used to be 1 in 10,000 people, and now I think it's really more like 1 in 1,000, and then maybe 1 in every 50 if you include the spectrum people.
Spectrum, okay.
And but I know every one of these families, one of these children needs to be helped as best you can.
I really, really appreciate it. This has been such a privilege for me. Yeah, absolute privilege. And thank you for taking the time today, because I know you're extremely busy.
And I just urge you and I commend you for what you're doing and hope you're successful in helping as many people as you can.